Good morning and welcome. If you could all please have a seat. Welcome to the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum. My name is Paul Wormser, and I'm the Deputy Director of the library, and I have the honor of welcoming all of you to the opening of George Washington's Acts of Congress. I'm going to give just a few remarks, but first I want to acknowledge some of our guests and welcome especially President Washington, who has come to join us. And Congressman Ed Royce, who will be giving some remarks. Most people know that the mission of the Nixon Library is to educate people about Richard Nixon and his times. Fewer people know that the presidential libraries all have a mission to educate people about American history in general, and specifically about the presidency. For that reason, we're really honored to have the opening for this exhibit today. What you will see later on in a few minutes is known as the Acts of Congress. It is a bound volume, one of 600 that were ordered by the first Congress of the United States, and they include the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the first legislation passed by the first Congress. The volume that we have to show you is especially unique because it is the one owned by George Washington and has annotations in it by the president, noting his duties and responsibilities. We would not have this here if it weren't for the generosity of the Mount Vernon's Ladies Association. The Mount Vernon's Ladies Association last year bought at auction this volume for more than $9 million, and it will be the centerpiece of a new George Washington library being constructed in Mount Vernon. In the meanwhile, while they are planning that library, they have offered to the National Archives to allow the book to tour each of the presidential libraries. So we are the second on that tour. Very pleased to have it. In addition to the book, I just want to note we've supplemented our exhibit with some of the materials from our local collection, so I don't want those to be lost in the excitement over the Acts of Congress Volume 2. We also have on display today an 1823 facsimile of the Declaration done by William Stone. We also have a small miniature book published in 1796 called Columbia's Legacy, which reprints George Washington's farewell address. And of course, we have a 1929 essay on the Constitution by a young Richard Nixon. He wrote it for a forensics competition. So please look for all of those things in the exhibit. And now quickly, I want to thank a couple of individuals and groups before we move on. Putting together an exhibit such as this is a lot of work. I would be remiss if I didn't, first of all, acknowledge my own staff who worked very hard on this. I want to also, again, acknowledge Mount Vernon for their generosity in allowing us to display this book. And then finally, I want to acknowledge and thank the Richard Nixon Foundation, who is our co-sponsor and who has worked throughout the process to build this exhibit. They've been wonderful, and I want to personally thank Sandy Quinn, the president of the Nixon Foundation, and to invite him up here so he can introduce our speakers.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Paul.
Thanks.
Thank you. The man wearing the funny hat next to me, I know you're all wondering who he is. Those of you who come to a lot of our events have seen President Washington here before, And we're delighted to have him back for this, which is a very appropriate occasion because we do have his book, his very book. And as you know, he was born in 1732 in Virginia. And in 1789, he stood on the steps of the federal courthouse, which is still there, and gave his first inaugural speech. And I had the pleasure of being there a couple of months ago and climbed up on that thing and stood next to President Washington's bronze image and had my picture taken like millions of other tourists do every year. But he was indeed the man who created this country, saved this country, won the Revolutionary War, and I'm honored to introduce the first President of the United States, President George Washington.
Almost 226 years ago, this May, I reluctantly went to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. I was installed as president of that convention in my blue and buff uniform to remind the delegates of the sacrifices of the Revolutionary War. Because as I stood there, I remembered the bloody footprints of my soldiers in the snow. I remembered the thousands that were taken prisoners on the British prison ships, of which only 10% ever lived. I remembered this and knew that we needed a constitution. My leadership was essential in shaping the document, and my presence lent prestige and dignity to all the proceedings. I was a unifying force in the deliberation, and we reached consensus and compromise that were necessary to make this a more perfect union. Many feel that the presidency was designed with me in mind. And I reminded Madison that everything we do will be a precedent for years to come. When I received the acts of Congress, I wrote notes in the margin to try to bring this parchment to life. Now, these are sacred pages of our democracy, written by faithful patriots for our freedoms and peaceful government. I had to make the judgment calls that would endure centuries of presidencies that are represented by this historic tour. The acts of Congress given to me in 1789 contain my personal copy of the U.S. Constitution, a draft of the Bill of Rights, and other documents related to the early acts of Congress. This was the blueprint of my administration. The contents of it have been defended by presidents, judges, and legislators for 225 years and will be valid for the unborn millions yet to be citizens of this great country. Twice, I took the oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. Today, as you see this book, you take an oath that you too will preserve, protect, and defend the words in that book.
Thank you, Mr. President. There's probably no better name known in Orange County besides Justin Bieber and Dennis Rodman than the name Royce. And today we have two of them, and I want you to meet Royce the Elder, World War II veteran, Ed Royce's father. Please stand. Where is he? Right there. See, this is pretty good, kids. You gotta take note of this. See, he's coming to check up on him. He doesn't see him in Washington all the time, but he says, "Okay, you're going to be over there. I want to hear you. I got to critique you like I used to do." Ed Royce, the younger, is a great friend of the Nixon family and of this institution. And he's here frequently. He's very supportive of us, and we're very appreciative of that. He is from the 39th District. He's an 11-term congressman, and he has been named chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee. And that, when you look at the history of the man who this library is named after, Richard Nixon, whose distinctions in foreign policy are known the world over, it's great that our congressman heads up that committee. So it's my pleasure to introduce Congressman Ed Royce. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Sandy, I appreciate that, and it is also good to have the real Ed Royce with us today. Good to see Ed Royce Senior. I think for us as Americans, when we have an opportunity to see something like this Acts of Congress, this document that George Washington held, and I've had the opportunity to look and see how when he gets to Article 2, he begins to underline and make notations about his power as president. I think we think back to the foundation of this republic, how lucky we were in terms of some of the architects of these documents, of these rights, and some of what they realized. But in the case of Washington, we had someone who had an understanding of why the Articles of Confederation was not going to work for this nation, why we needed a document to pull us together as a nation, to make us strong as a nation. He'd seen us tested in war and come through that as a nation. But he knew we needed one national market in terms of economics, one ability as a country to conduct our foreign policy. And so he agitated for this convention. And of course, when he arrived on May 25th and the convention began, it was unanimous that he should preside over it. And the very gravitas of having him preside over that convention helped keep those delegates there together, focused on that common purpose. But it's not just the legacy of what he did at the convention and his subsequent election. 2 years later, 1789, when they finished their work. But it was the fact that during those 8 years as president, the thoughtful way, the measured way in which he conducted himself as president and in which he helped define the way in the future that the presidency would undertake that enormous responsibility, but do so within the systems of checks and balances that the founders of our government had helped establish. And so, as president, he did a lot to define the constitutional role of his office, but he acted with restraint. And he set for us, I think, a model that other presidents have tried to follow. And he did so because he knew that the Constitution was one of the most important documents designed in the history of civilization with respect to the ideal that it was the individual who would be guaranteed the power, the freedom, the liberty. This was a new thought, that the power didn't rest in the state. The power rested in each of us as Americans, our individual rights. That the foundation of a free society is the principle of individual rights. And men like Washington, I think, took a great deal of responsibility on their shoulders. Because if you think about the history of civilization, for them, this was the first time since Athens that this concept of a democratic republic, of the autonomy of the individual, that would be held sacrosanct, that it was not going to be the government. The United States, I think, as a result, began to represent to people all over the globe at the time, all of those struggling toward freedom. It began to represent a model of perhaps what they could achieve. And our Constitution and our Bill of Rights established in that Constitution then became, for a world trying to come into a second enlightenment, trying to rediscover perhaps something of what had existed in the distant past before the Dark Ages, what had existed before the divine rights of kings, when in democratic Athens or in the Roman Republic, people actually had some measure of individual liberty. They looked to the United States. All previous systems had regarded the state as supreme. And I remember talking to one of the architects of a constitution in Eastern Europe, who shared with me that it was the United States that held that the moral purpose of a government is the protection of those individual liberties, that the government's function in this country had been changed from the role of ruler to the role of servant, that the government was set to protect men from the criminals and the Constitution was set to protect men from the government. This is someone who had read the Founding Fathers. The Bill of Rights was not directed against private citizens, but against the government as an explicit declaration that individual rights supersede any public or societal power. And it's these concepts that help push Eastern Europe during those important struggles to liberate. And they're these ideals that around the world cause others today to look at that Constitution of the United States as a model. Alexander Hamilton was perhaps George Washington's closest friend. And to him, the most important concept was the uncorruptibility of the civil service, if you remember. That ideal that a government official may do nothing except that which is legally permitted, while an individual citizen can do anything except that which is legally prohibited. The Constitution is not a charter for government power, but a charter of the citizen and the citizen's protection against an overpowerful government. And the last thought that I think I'd leave you with, the thought that I think the architects of our republic were most concerned with, was this thought that a government free to do anything it pleases, based on its whim, is one that begins to encroach and leave a situation where the citizen may only act by permission. And the goal of people in establishing this republic who sacrificed so greatly was to make absolutely certain that this nation, in this Constitution, would create a common ground for individual liberty so that we could all understand and practice our rights, our freedoms, and duties without fear, and so that we could bravely and boldly be the standard for the world in its effort to move to individual liberty. I thank you very much for what you're doing by bringing Washington's collection here and this demonstration of our Constitution, because it is certainly important that the next generations of Americans learn about these documents, and it's certainly important that we continue around the world to hold up these values as a light, as a beacon to others who seek freedom. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. I wish you had time to go give that same talk to every high school history class in Orange County. I don't think they're hearing those values today. So thank you, sir. Now, we have to have a ribbon cutting. That's what you do with new exhibits. So the exhibit is down the hall here in our special temporary exhibit gallery, so you'll see it in a minute. But we have to have a symbolic ribbon cutting. So I'm going to ask the president and the congressman to come over here, and these youngsters. I have a handheld. So I want you to say hello to these kids. And let's see who they are. Now, kids, when I mention your name, would you raise your hand? Amanda Casey? J.T. Casey? Oh, no, pardon me. Yeah, okay, your brother's sister, right? Did I get that right? You're not married, I know that. So, Ian Hawks and Grace Hicks, Alita Swift, and Megan Swift. All right, now, I wanted to use a cherry tree and an axe, but I didn't think the kids would be able to do that. The scissors, by the way, we thank South Coast Plaza for them. They loaned them to us because they do store openings all the time. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. Congressman and President, thank you for honoring us. We now invite all of you to your right and go down the hall and take a look at history. Kids, thank you very much for coming.